Hello and welcome to this expert talk from Skill Me Up. Today we're going to be discussing Azure Management Updates as of February 2021. Please keep in mind this is only going to be a summary of a few key updates. There are always a ton of changes in the Azure environment, as anybody I'm sure can tell you who's worked in it for more than just a month or so. But we're going to call out a few key ones that we think are going to be interesting and useful to you. Please feel free to take your time, pause through this, and explore out any of these updates. We look to make these a little bit more regular because Azure is a constantly changing environment. A lot of these are not going to be new for February 2021. They're just going to be relatively recent updates. In the future, we'll continue to bring out additional ones, but we want to make sure that y'all see some of the new key things that are coming out in Azure that relate directly around management and infrastructure around the Azure platform. So with that in mind, my name is Kid Skinner. I am an instructor here with Skill Me Up and Ops Agility. I've been doing a lot of things around the Azure space and IT for well over 20 years now. I am a senior cloud trainer architect here, but I look to try and bring some of the knowledge and information to you. A few things we're going to be talking about is the moving of the resources between regions. This is something that's always been a little bit available, but we want to show you some new features that are available there. There's also now SMS Login as an option. We're talking about some storage updates. Most of them are in preview, but want to make sure you all are aware of some nice new features that are coming out in that aspect, as well as the new Azure AD SLA. That's going to be a big one too. Some load balancer changes, as well as some GitHub introduction, which is or integration rather, which is something that will be going over a lot in the coming months, as well as some naming rules documentation. That's just a personal call out, as well as some automation tasks. So with that in mind, one of the big things about the Azure resource moves, we always would have our resources, whether it be virtual machines, networks, they're always in a particular region, and they were tied primarily to that region. There were processes that we had that would allow you to move an option or a resource from one region to another. For virtual machines, you could use Azure Site Recovery to move a machine from one region to another. If the resource was just a stateless resource where you could just grab its configuration information, you could export its template and then deploy the template to a new region, and you'd essentially have the same resource but in a different region. There were some other things around that what we could do as far as migrating those resources. However, now there's the Azure Resource Mover, and what the Azure Resource Mover allows you to do is you can go to a resource that is supported. You can go into the move dropdown option, and while there were options in the past to move it to another subscription or move it to a resource group, those are all management plane changes, and basically just moved where the pointers were for accessing that resource. The resource itself never physically actually moved. It was just the management plane. There's now the move to another region, and this allows you to use the Azure Resource Mover to go through and move the resource from one physical location to another physical location, and I'll take you through that process. Now, on the back end, it's still using most of the technologies we did use in the past. If you do an Azure Resource Mover to move a virtual machine from one region to another, we're basically going to be doing ASR type of process along it, where we're going to be grabbing those blocks across. You can also select multiple resources at a time. If you want to move all the virtual machines on a VNet over, you can just grab that virtual network and grab all the resources attached to it, the NICs, the disks, and everything else, and just move those all across. The Azure Resource Mover will, do the pre-checks, make sure everything's good to go, and walk you through that whole process. Now, obviously, there's going to be some outages periodically as you move something like a VM between regions, but it's going to take you through that whole process. It is something now that's directly listed in the interface now as a move to another region. One of the big key places that we actually use this more often is as we start expanding additional data centers. For instance, there was a suite and data center that was recently introduced, and people that may have had their resources in a different European data center, they want to move it into that one. As those new data centers get spun up, this is a nice feature where you can go ahead and start deploying to an existing data center, and then once those new Azure data centers become available, you can move your resources over there to be within that geographical reference that you're needing, but still be able to take advantage of the Azure clouds before all the expansion takes place. This is just one of those common things that are out there, but it's the Azure Resource Mover. And it's definitely a easier way to move things between regions. New feature now for logging into Azure logging into Azure AD even, is text message SMS login authentications. This basically gives users the ability to log in via phone. Now, you don't want to do necessarily something like this with a privileged account, something with a sort of admin rights. This is more designed around, you have a user out in the field, they're working from a mobile device, you need them to be able to get in and check a particular status, or be able to do something and not have to sit here there and type out their entire username and maybe try and figure out their phone and stuff. So this is a new method that allows you to do that authentication directly via SMS login. It's a very useful tool in those types of environments where you're needing somebody out in the field to be able to access it. But it does have its limitations. It is something that is not something you want to do just on the fly for the fun of it. It is definitely something that you want to take the time to look at it and go through the authentication and set up and look at it. But it is really just intended for temporary users that are accessing things from the field. Again, this is the call out of where those actually entries are. Okay. Storage accounts actually got a new update, something that's been around. We use these a lot. They're always making small changes here and there, but there's a few instances there, really nice add-ons that they've added into the storage accounts that are becoming useful. One is that we have the explicit resource instance connections in the firewall. What this allows you to do is that, in the past you could say, went to this virtual network and these machines on your private network to be able to access, or put in a private endpoint to access a single device. But if you had a SQL pass service, you basically were saying that any Azure resource could access your virtual, your storage account rather. Well, Azure obviously did its production. They want to make sure that those resources were only authenticated by people who were, when they access it, did potentially give that ability to where a resource that wasn't intended could theoretically have network access to your storage account. So what they've now added in is in the individual instances in the firewall. Another nice thing is that there's in preview is a blob access via NFS. So if you want to be able to use NFS to access storage accounts, in the past we do have the Azure files for SMB, but we also now have blob access via NFS. So if you're using Linux machines, Docker containers, anything that you would be looking to use an NFS access for a storage, you can actually use blob storage. Just to kind of show you all what that looks like right now. Oh, that's a future piece we're getting to. Let's jump over to our storage accounts. So you'll notice here in the blob station, we now have the NFS v3 option. You can set up how you want to have the access set up for the environment, whether you want to be TLS, if you want to enable large file shares, and all these particular settings. And then also in your networking space, when you move over to the selected networks, we always had these options where we could do explicit virtual networks. You could do by firewall IPS addresses. We also have this option down here, allow trusted Microsoft services to the storage account. But again, it was pretty much all or nothing. And now we have this new section here, this the resource type instance, and you can select starting off with the type of resources. These are the current ones that are listed out there, but you can do Microsoft SQL servers, for instance. And you can come in here and you can, again, say all the SQL servers in your particular tenant, just this current subscription or the same resource group as the storage account. But you can also select individual resource here. And so by just doing that, you're now making sure that only that particular resource is the one that had it. You could then uncheck this exception. In that particular instance, it allows you to be a little bit more secure with your networking and your storage accounts. Gives you a little bit better protection. And this is something they added relatively recently. Another key feature that's recently brought up is that with Azure AD Premium, there is now an SLA explicitly around 99.99%. That equates to effectively 5 minutes downtime per year at that 99.99%. So if you do have Azure AD Premium licenses, this is now something that is in effect with anything with Azure AD Premium. Obviously, Azure AD is a key function for any resources that you're using in the cloud with Azure AD. Having this premium SLA in place ensures you the reliability of the environment you're expecting to use. Again, this isn't just Azure Portal. This is Office 365. This is third-party SaaS services. Your applications that are using Azure AD, anything like that that are using Azure AD as its identity provider is going to get that assurance that there is 99.9%, 99.99% SLA for the environment. And again, this requires no real configuration. You just simply enable the Azure AD Premium licensing, and that SLA goes into effect. We've never had to do any high availability configuration with Azure AD. It's always been inherent in the service itself. It's always available throughout the cloud. However, if you do upgrade to the premium level of Azure AD, they ensure that the replication and reliability is definitely going to get you that 99.9%. And they're standing behind that with that SLA. Everybody has the basic Azure AD assurances, and you have that built-in replication across the globe, but it doesn't actually come with that SLA guarantee. So that gives those premium users a little bit added assurances and security around the Azure AD space. Another nice feature in the add-ons is the load balancer being able to switch between basic and standard. In the past, when you need to switch a load balancer between whether it be premium or basic, you would have to go through a process of saving off the configuration and essentially removing that load balancer and then recreating in the new state. There's now just a simple option to switch it from one to the other, and when it does that, it switches the load balancer, and if there's any public IPs associated with it, because the public IPs have to match whatever that standard is. There's some features that come up with the standard version of the things like the high availability rules, the number of rules that's available, a few things around that. There's just some key features that are available only in the standard version, and sometimes people would find their deployments, they would start off in basic and then they would realize they need to move to standard, and it basically required you to wipe it out and recreate it. But there's now a direct move to go from basic to standard on the fly. If you're not familiar with it, Microsoft recently acquired GitHub, and they're continuing to keep it open source. They're just the ones that are now responsible for it and making sure that it stays out there. But as part of that acquisition, Azure's moving a lot of their resources to GitHub. Things that may have been in own separate resource information or resource deposits, they're slowly moving a lot of those over to GitHub, simply because it is now a Microsoft resource. And they want to make sure that they're also more part of the open source community, and they want to get that available. They want to make sure that it is easier for people to get to all the resources. Well, one of the latest ones is that Azure Automation now provides the option to put resources into GitHub and have their repositories out in GitHub. In the past, they would use Azure PowerShell Gallery for all of the PowerShell entries, but we've now moved this over to GitHub. What this allows you to do is be able to access those resources directly by going out to GitHub if you want. It allows people for doing pull requests so the community can update them. They still have to be approved by whoever the Microsoft owner is for those particular resources, but it allows you to be able to see what's out there, have more user contribution to it, and just make it more generalized and open repository for people to examine and see what's out there, and not have to go between multiple different repositories just to be able to see the different resources in Azure. This is just one of the latest ones that's been moved over into GitHub. They still have things on the PowerShell gallery, but they're moving those over to GitHub, copying them at least over to GitHub, and going forward, they'll be moving most of their resources just in GitHub, so they may not appear in the PowerShell gallery going forward for new resources. This is a personal one that I want to make sure was explicitly called out. Whenever you work in Azure, pretty much all the Azure resources are very tied to their name. And so it's always been important to make sure that you have a good quality naming standard for your resources out there. However, different resources have different naming rules. You know, storage accounts have to be lowercase, so just numbers and letters pretty much. But they also have to be globally unique. Whereas a virtual machine, if it's running Windows, you can only have 12 characters, but they can be pretty much any letter, number, DNS dashes. It can be pretty much anything, but you're limited to only a few characters. And then you have things like logic apps and resource groups where you have pretty much free reign to call it just about anything you want to. Spaces, uppercase, lowercase, doesn't really matter. So there's lots of different resources that have lots of different naming standards. They now have documented that into a single document. You could always go out and find what the different naming standards were. They would call out a lot of the key ones, but they've updated this central page, and they're going to maintain this central page for any particular resources that are out in Azure. Anything that has a naming need is all going to be listed on the single page for anybody to come out and reference. So I highly recommend you take a look at these naming rules. Also, if you have not done naming standards for your organization, to say, if you're creating a storage account, it needs to follow this naming context. If you're creating a VM, calling this naming context, I highly recommend you do that. Use this as a source page to identify what the restrictions from Azure are, and then being able to identify for these particular resources, these are what our standards are going to be for a company. Okay. Again, these were things that were always out there, but the fact that they've now put this into a single document that they're going to continue to maintain and update, it makes it really easy for you to keep track of what's actually out there and what's needed. Another nice new feature for a lot of resources in Azure is they now have tasks, and it's currently in preview. This is again another one of those options that was actually kind of out there already. It just wasn't as easy to get to and wasn't directly manageable. So, for instance, if you're working with a virtual machine in the past, you would a lot of times want to have it shut down or start up at a certain time. We've always had the option to do an auto shutdown for VMs for years, where it could always set up a scheduled time where a virtual machine would always be shut down. That way you're assured that a machine that wasn't supposed to be running 24/7 was definitely shut down at the end of the day. The problem was there wasn't an option to do an automatic start. There were lots of different ways that we could achieve this. One of them was an Azure Automation. There was a specific solution around doing start and stop time for virtual machines. That was one of the first ones. It wasn't always necessarily the nicest and cleanest and required a lot of setup in order to get to work, but it was definitely one of those ones that were out there. There were then options where people would set up a logic app to go out and run a logic app that was triggered on a schedule to start a virtual machine. It would require you to go out and set up a logic app and know how to set it up and do that type of interface. And it worked well, but it was something that you had to go through the logic app. They now have an option down here under automation, you'll notice under task preview. And this isn't just virtual machines, this is actually a lot of different resources. They have those out there. They now have automation tasks. And if you wanted to set up a task, you simply go to add, And you'll see these are a few of the common select templates that they have out there. Again, this is in preview. There's likely going to continue to add additional ones. These are also filtered out to the individual type of resource. If you go look at storage accounts, there's actually a different one here. But you'll notice here we have the just these particular ones, and you can go through the process of selecting which ones you wanted to be able to do. If you want to power off or shut them down, they will create these connections. If you've worked with Logic App before, you're starting to see that this is where we're starting to see those entries now. And then you can set up those configuration details. You go out there and you just create the task, and then you'll have your scheduled desk that gets created. In this one, you'll see that I have out here. They'll have a the start time, and it runs a daily setup. So it runs it every day at 1 a.m. Now, what that does when it gets created is if you go back into the resource group of whatever resource is that you created, it has now put out a Logic App. And there'll be connectors if you set up any connectors for that particular task. For instance, it just created this Logic App that has the recurrence trigger. It's going to start up the virtual machine and then do those notifications. If you haven't worked with Logic Apps before, they're actually very useful tools. It's really easy to set them up, and they give you this nice graphical walkthrough. What is actually going on in the back end is a JSON that has all the different steps configured as entry points, and then they have a run after tab that gives it what the workflow process is. But this is what the actual Logic App is, and seeing all the settings in there. The designer is where you usually do most of your changes. It gives you the option to do a lot more steps and actions. But the idea here is that you now have the tasks directly in whatever resource it is that has those automation pieces available directly associated with it. Just like in the past, you could do backups through the backup vault, and you now have the options in here where you can go directly to backup. This is the same type of thing with tasks. We could always do that in Logic Apps, but we're now scoping them and tying them to the direct resource and being able to come directly in here and make those changes. You are still charged the same rate that they do for Logic Apps, where they're charging you by step. There's no change there, but it is relatively cheap to do a quick Logic App that just says start up and shut down. I mentioned that was a virtual machine as an option, but they do also have them, for instance, for the storage account. You can do that monthly cost for the resource, but you can also do a delete blob as a scheduled task to go out and explicitly remove blobs of a certain age. So those types of things are options now. You'll also see a lot of small options, small changes in the portal periodically. One of the most recent ones that a lot of people have been seeing that you'll see in documentation, the old yes/no options that you would have when you create a resource have now been replaced by checkboxes wherever they showed up. You would a lot of times have management options. You would do a yes/no is what the old documentation would have you, because that's what it was there. It never really made a whole lot of sense. Probably the checkboxes is something that gives you that that useful interface. It doesn't have to be language specifics, and everybody is very understanding of what a checkbox is. Either you enable it or you disable it. This is just a few of the updates within the portal. They continue to make constant updates in the Azure resource environment. We will continue to make those changes as we make you aware of a lot of those changes as they're coming through. Feel free to follow the Azure portal blogs as well, where they're sending out those updates. They come out on a regular basis. One of the most recent ones earlier this week was the new high trust compliancy that includes 172 resources are showing up as compliant now as of the report from 2020 that was released just earlier this week. So that's another big one to keep an eye out for if you're in the high trust realm. there's always going to be changes in Azure. We're always looking for new updates. And if you have any questions or need any help in training and understanding the updates in Azure, please always keep us in mind whenever you're looking out there. Skill Me Up is providing a lot of new training with our academy. We are always providing new resources and new knowledge around your ever-growing experiences in Azure, as well as other cloud spaces. So thank you again. I appreciate you for listening to this talk. My name is Kit Skinner. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Skill Me Up, or out on the social medias as Azure SMFX. Thank you.